So yeah, let's start so we can finish up before the World Series wild card game. It's the one sport that I really pay attention to, which is baseball, and I use it as a real diversion. And it's not as violent as most of the other sports. But anyhow, except for bass fishing. Bass fishing is very. All right, let's go around and introduce ourselves then.
Well, the fish think that it's violent.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know if you ever saw the Saturday Night Live routine that Dan Aykroyd did it with the Bass-O-Matic, it was called.
I think so.
About taking a bass and putting it in a mixer. And anyhow, all right. So, Kathy, why don't you start? We're just going to go around and introduce ourselves. And
I'm
say
Kathy Radner. Hi.
how long we've been members. Or members.
Well, my husband Russell and I have been members probably over 25 years.
Okay, I'm Fran Shor, and Barb and I, my wife and I, have been members, I don't know, 3 years, I guess, even though both she and I knew people in the congregation and were around it and were sympathetic to it, and actually were married by Miriam Jarris in 1995, being one of the few Jewish couples to get married by somebody from the Birmingham Temple, since it's usually mixed marriages. Okay, continuing on, Lenore, I guess is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm Lenore Kingston. My husband's walking the dog right now because we just fed her. Anyways, so because it's 5 o'clock here, not 7. Anyways, so I was a member of Birmingham Temple through the 90s. And we moved here in 2006. And then when the membership changed and we decided to try it again because we really missed it. So we've been a member now. I think we're starting our 3rd year, something like that.
And it sounds like you're in a different place then, if it's a different time zone, obviously.
Yes,
Where are you calling in from?
Right, I'm in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado.
Ah,
That's where we moved to because of our children and grandchildren, right? That's the only thing that could have gotten me away because I was very connected with Becca Smith. You know, we were really doing a lot of creative things together. We would bounce ideas. And Anne Marie Fisher, who's now, you know, the executive, she was the 7th grade teacher when I was there. Anyways, so it was great.
Thanks, Lenore. Continuing circle.
What's your husband's name, Lenore?
Ron, he's walking
Ron.
right now, right?
Carolyn, do you want to go next?
Oh, sure. Carolyn Lowe, and I've been a member for about 10 years, maybe 10 years. Yeah, 10 years, but I was 15 when Rabbi Wine came to my comparative religions class with Mr. Gaw and talked about the Birmingham Temple, which I definitely had an affinity for right then because I've been an atheist since I was 7, but I was raised Orthodox, so obviously I couldn't go to the Birmingham Temple at 15.
Thanks, Carolyn. Laura, you're up.
sure. So my name is Laura Castleman. The rest of my family's got the last name of Schechter. And we joined the Birmingham Temple, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit, approximately 12 years ago, I think, mainly when our kids were young, and we just really connected with the people when we walked in the door. The rest of my family is pretty involved in the temple as well. And I'm really excited to meet some new faces here.
Sorry, that's my daughter.
I guess Elaine. Oh,
I'm next because,
Yeah.
you know, everyone's computer's different.
oh, that's,
I'm Elaine Fieldman, and I joined the temple in 1995. And Carolyn and I have something in common because I've been an atheist since I've been 7. Um, but anyhow, I gave the other strand a try till I was about 15 or 16. And then I said, no, it still doesn't work for me. So I went back to my 7-year-old judgment. And I've been a member ever since. There was a time I was less active, but I never gave up my membership.
Thank you. And now that leaves,
Sid and Rosalie.
yeah,
Okay. Hi, well, Sid and I were obviously the senior members here for a lot of reasons. But we, not just because of our gray hair, we actually joined the temple in about the 2nd year of its formation,
well,
when not among the original 8 members, when there was about 35 members at the time. And we joined because we had one child who was 5 and one who was 3 and another one who wasn't at that time. But but we wanted our children to have some Jewish background, but we didn't want a theistic background. And Sherwin just was the breath of spring. I mean, into what the world was in those years and what the Jewish world was in those years. And so we've been with the temple throughout its various iterations and leadership changes, and it's fairly somewhat consistent philosophy, somewhat inconsistent philosophy. But in any case, in those years, all the weddings were Jewish weddings. It was Sherwin took a stand early on in which he would perform interfaith marriages, and he was so chastised by the total rabbinic leadership, as well as the Jewish news, as well as everybody else. But the rabbis came down on him with such a vengeance. And and it was probably almost 20 years after that before some of the Reform rabbis would agree to marry Jewish background people and non-Jewish background people. So
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody for being here tonight. And just to cover the ground rules, in effect, this is broken down into 4 sessions. We met 2 weeks ago with just some, me giving a little bit of the biographical background to Albert Einstein, and then talking in general about some of the themes that we've been exploring over the years, and getting a sense of how people perceived Einstein prior to reading any of the material collected in this book. And what we're going to do tonight is begin in the first of 3 sessions on specific chapters from this book, Einstein on Politics, and talk about what I've tried to do in the way of organizing this both chronologically and thematically. So for this week, we're dealing with chapters 1, 4, and 5. And these are, to think of it in biographical terms, these are the years, basically 1914 to 1933, that Einstein moved back to Berlin, moved back to Germany. So he moved there because he had gained a reputation as a stellar scientist, as a physicist, and was invited by Max Planck to come to Berlin and to teach in Berlin, to do research essentially in Berlin. In 33, he was actually, as other Jews were, forced to flee when Hitler came to power. And so in that period, in that 20-year period, what we see through these primary documents of Albert Einstein in chapters 1, 4, and 5 are some common threads. Among them are Einstein's fierce criticism of war and criticism of nationalism, and embrace, up until 1933, what seemed to be an absolute pacifism. Now that would change when Hitler came to power. So in some respects, it was more of a situational pacifism than an absolute pacifism, but a pacifism nonetheless that brought him into contact with not only other public intellectuals like Romain Rolland and others, Gandhi, who were themselves pacifists, but also with a whole range of pacifist organizations, including things that still exist, like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which, believe it or not, was founded in the United States by Jane Addams, among others. There's that theme of pacifism, opposition to war. There's also in these primary documents that we see and we'll be talking about, Einstein's insistence that there has to be an international, there has to be some kind of international solidarity. First and foremost, among scientists. There cannot be any boundaries, as we well know from COVID, right? There cannot be any boundaries in the way in which science is not only practiced, but also science is further illuminated. So the research that goes on and the sort of thing that Einstein was particularly interested in was trying to break down those national boundaries. And this got him into trouble, right? I mean, not only did his pacifism get him into trouble, and not only did his anti-war attitudes, but his embrace of this kind of international scientific elite. And then finally, his role after 1919, when the general theory of relativity was basically was proven by Eddington in this experiment that was done during the solar eclipse about the orbit of Mercury. He became almost overnight an instant celebrity. So he was then being constantly urged to give his thoughts on any number of topics, including on religion. And there is an interesting thread here, including one of what I found one of the more intriguing articles that he wrote, which is in chapter 5 about what I believe. And it designates what his sort of following, as your editors say, some of the thinking of Sigmund Freud on the future of an illusion that Freud wrote and that Einstein was familiar with. That's one of the other themes. There may very well be other additional themes that you've been able to identify in your readings, but those I think are the main ones in this 20-year period. And as we work our way through these 3 chapters and through, we're not going to talk about each and every one of the entries. I'll try to highlight some of them. And as you recall, I did give everybody an assignment last time, which was in your reading to select one article, one of the entries that spoke most to you. So we're going to do that by working our way through each of these 3 chapters. So when we come to one of the chapters, either chapter 1, 4, or 5, that your entry is part of, feel free to volunteer your thinking on that particular essay. So we're going to start with chapter 1. This goes from 1914 to 1921. And of course, the outbreak of World War I happens very shortly after Einstein gets to Berlin. And he's immediately asked by Max Planck, none other, to sign on to a manifesto of 93 prominent German scientists who wanted to be able, in the response to how Germany was being represented internationally, particularly by England and by France, as the real barbarians, right? I mean, they had invaded Belgium and they had actually committed war crimes already, but all the other countries would eventually get there, not only to Belgium, but the Commission of War Crimes. So these German scientists signed a manifesto that they wanted Albert Einstein to sign. And of course, he would have nothing to do with it because of its extreme nationalism, its creation of these borders and boundaries. And instead, he signed on through the insistence of Georg Nicolai, who was another German scientist, but also a pacifist, to a dissenting document and became part of what was known as the New Fatherland Association, which was a pacifist organization, which was, the organization was, didn't last very long. It was shut down in 1916 by the German government. And it's important to point out that England did the same thing to its organizations. It suppressed dissent. It criminalized dissent. Once the United States entered the war in 1917, the passage of the Sedition Act also criminalized dissent in the United States. The Socialist Party newspapers and offices were destroyed by the federal government. The IWW, the Radical Labor Movement, the industrial workers of the world, their offices were destroyed. Their members were put on trial, not for anything they did, but for what they said. So this was a horrible time. And as we well know, war is not healthy. It may be healthy for the power of the state, but it's not healthy for dissent. It's often said that the first casualty of war is truth, and follows from that if somebody's speaking a dissenting truth. So Einstein was taking some very outspoken positions. Once the New Fatherland Association was shut down, he tried to remain a little bit out of the limelight, but nonetheless continued to write, if not always publicly, then privately, about his own particular political orientation. So is there anything that you read, any of us read in chapter 1 that you feel you want to discuss or spoke to you in general before I continue to blather on? Yes.
I was very impressed with the point he made in chapter 1 that he had, I believe, made earlier, a little bit on in the introduction that was made, in terms of the internationalism and how incredibly important internationalism was, not only theoretically, but that how you could not separate science, true science, from internationalism, that the only way the scientist could be a true scientist would be in an international world. And the only way you could have true nationalism is if you had full scientific inquiry, etc. And I thought he had a number of passages on that in that particular chapter. And that really struck a chord with me,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's that will be a thread throughout the rest of his life. Um, you know, it certainly is true in the aftermath of World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, trying to reach out and thinking through what he said even early on about the attempt to transcend national sovereignty and establish some kind of world government, in fact, that would be able to actually prevent this kind of warfare. And as he called it, the narrow nationalistic sentiment that leads people in various countries to hate others. Yeah, so anything else that you read in any of those entries in chapter 1 that spoke to you?
Well, Fran, I just at the very beginning, and not that it really was that prescient, but I think, just he just said from the very beginning of World War One, or when it was, inkling about, that no good is going to come of it. There is no good that comes from war, where, Middle Ages or whatever, there was a thought, of course, good's going to come from war. We're going to get land, we're going to get power, we're going to get whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, he predicted, not that it was so difficult to predict, that of course no good was going to come of it, which of course no good did come of it.
I would amend that slightly. And certainly the number of people who died was just massive amount. Millions perished, mostly soldiers, right, who died of their battle wounds, or died of gas attacks. And what'll change, of course, from World War I to World War II is the majority of deaths in World War I were combatants. The majority of deaths in World War II were non-combatants. I mean, it was a slaughter. It became more of a slaughterhouse as in World War II. And I think that the one thing that might have come out of it was the fall of these empires, the fall of the German Empire, the fall of the Russian Empire, the beginning of transformations, the challenges to the British Empire. All of these things were unloosed by World War I, that had both a positive impact and then also sometimes went in opposite directions. In fact, recall that Einstein wrote about the fall of the German Empire in 1918, because as the war went on and on and on, most of the governments believed it was going to be over in 6 months. And that's part of the blinders and the arrogance of power. It went on and on, slogging on and taking millions of lives. When it did end, by the time that people had become so war weary, people were many of the civilians in Austria, Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, because food was being ferried to the front, there was large scale sickness that led to the flu, the influenza epidemic. I mean, people's immune systems were severely compromised because of the lack of food. So there's a connection there. But the fall of the empire in Germany opened up the possibility that there would be a democracy instead of an autocracy. And this was what Einstein was looking for. And even though there were these revolutionary uprisings led by the Spartacist League with Rosa Luxemburg, among others, who was then murdered, a Polish Jewish woman who was a brilliant political theoretician. What Einstein wrote is a revelation of his core belief in democracy. And that's one of the other things that follows him throughout these chapters and all throughout his lives. Because what was going on was this revolutionary upheaval, and there was the beginning of this polarization of on the far left and far right. What Einstein wrote and tried to address to students, actually, he said all true Democrats must be vigilant lest the class tyranny of the right, meaning the old empire, be replaced by the new class tyranny of the left, namely communism. And he says later on the same sort of thing. I'm not a fan of either, the Italian state or the Russian state, right? Soviet state. So neither Italian fascism or Soviet communism. So it's a thread because he's trying to lift up his understanding of what democracy is. But of course, his understanding of democracy is fundamentally premised on the idea of a social democracy. That is, you've got to take care of the least of these. You've got to make sure that people have their fundamental needs met of housing, of healthcare, of food, those sorts of things. Something we really need in this country, now that I can get up on my soapbox. Yes.
I think it was in chapter 5, he specifically talks about comparing the democracy in the United States to more established in Europe, where there's a commitment to taking care of people.
Yes.
Even though not all their institutions were democratic, but compared to this country being so individualistic. But yeah.
Yeah. In fact, yeah, I mean, Bismarck, to his credit, although this was deliberately done to try to co-opt the left, Bismarck, the chancellor in the in the 1880s and 1890s, already introduced a form of pension and a form of Social Security. So Germany was way ahead of the United States and still remains way ahead of the United States. Angela Merkel when they talk about Angela Merkel in the media as being a conservative, she's to the left of Bernie Sanders. That's how skewed this system, our system, is to the right. I mean, yeah, if Einstein had to choose now between being in Germany and being in the United States, I think he'd choose being in Germany. But then, he spared no ink when it came to criticizing what he saw as German nationalism and German militarism. And this would be, a thread throughout. The other thing I think that's interesting is when he talks about, in this article in chapter 1, my opinion of war. And this will lead later on to that incredible exchange he has with Sigmund Freud. Because what he talks about is that part of it is gender-based, right? That war, it's part of the aggressive nature of men. Barbara Ehrenreich, a really wonderful writer, has an introduction to a book by a German social psychologist, Klaus Theobald, on war, and she on the right wing, and she talks about war again in gender terms and nature of. There are others who, Sarah Ruddick, and there are a number of feminists who develop a whole theory of war based upon male aggression. The point is that there are instances where males in some societies, very small, very limited, are not as aggressive. They're more like bonobo chimps. Bonobo chimps essentially in a matriarchal society, and men don't make war because they effectively, when they get any aggressive instinct, they make love. And they are the true make love, not war creatures. So, so Einstein begins this process to talk about war and its connection to gender, its connection to this kind of nationalism and the religion of power, as he calls it, the religion of power. And this is something that carries through these three chapters.
Hey, Fran,
Okay. Yes.
Can I make a comment about,
Sure,
I
sure.
don't know if you go, there were a couple things that caught my eye that I wanted to comment on in the early chapters. I can't remember if it was chapter 1 or 2, but early on. I read this, I'm a slow reader, and I read it a long time when you first put the announcement out. And I remember what caught my eye on chapter 1 that we haven't talked about yet is how he related as a person to the community about his science. And I know it's not the topic of the book club or even the book, but it was in there. And one of the things I caught myself talking to my family a lot about was it was really interesting to read, to me, this person who obviously we grew up as this like mythical person that changed science, but this was before then. And this was when he was just sure of his ideas and they weren't proven yet. And they were really radical. And I've tried so many times to understand them. And they're so hard to understand. And hearing him try to simplify what it was before the world said, you're right. To me, that was completely fascinating. That like, here's this person who totally knew he was right, even though he was basically saying, flip everything on its head like that. And it made me think about people these days who also see things revolutionarily. So that's one thing I think that I want to highlight. And then the second just came up for me, frankly, just now, Fran, with what you were saying about gender, and it is woven throughout the chapters that we'll be discussing. I almost want to criticize it on the opposite. It's hard for me to embrace that side of his writing about gender when he speaks so little of his wife. I feel like, where is your wife in all this?
Strange.
It comes up for me over and over and over.
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, no, to that point particularly, he is estranged from Milos Marker, who he marries and has two sons. There was apparently a daughter born before they officially wed, who disappears. We never really learn much about her. But he clearly was very engaged with her in that early period in Zurich, in Switzerland, when she was a student with him, when she helped him on his work in physics. And although she wasn't successful in graduating as he did and getting a position as he eventually did, because it took him a little while before he got that university position. Nonetheless, she was seen as a co-equal partner, at least initially by him. But as he becomes more and more estranged from her and becomes more enamored of his cousin, Elsa, that she passes even more into the background. So it is there's much to be criticized about Einstein's attitude towards his wives and towards his family. He even says at one point is he sees himself as kind of a singular person who doesn't have tight connections to even his family. Yeah, Kathy.
Well, actually, that's the point that really struck me, and it fit in with what Laura said, but you just said it's in chapter 5, when he talks about his passionate interest in social justice and social responsibility always stood in curious contrast to a marked lack of desire for direct association with men and women. And what he talked about is that he went on in that paragraph how he's so committed to social justice and of course to science and et cetera, but that he really just prefers his own company. And so it was just a very, it really struck me because like all people, especially Albert Einstein, he's very, very complicated.
Yes.
I thought that.
And it seems to me that maybe you don't feel the same way, that it's somewhat disingenuous. I guess I would say, when we see all the letters, when we see all the people who he actually had friendships with, I mean, it was pretty extensive. And it may be that because, he moved around a certain amount, and it may be that he did take solace in his solitary pursuit of science. He had to sort of excuse himself as being this kind of solitary person, and somewhat of an eccentric. But I think I don't think he was as eccentric as he's often portrayed in the media, and sometimes he himself talks about. He had these networks that he was part of, internationally and nationally.
But a lot of them were networks of ideas. I mean, they're
Right.
intellectual networks, and that's how he communicated and parsed through some of his ideas, et cetera, between him and Freud, and all these
Yeah.
other amazing people. But yeah, it's different. Yeah. But
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
he's
you're right.
a very unique person, I think.
The other thing that Laura raised that I think is also important is her first point about his science, and how, as a scientist, he once, as I pointed out earlier, in 1919, once the general theory of relativity was essentially proven, and he became this figure of world renown. He was constantly being bombarded with requests and with concerns about, oh, Mr. Einstein, speak about this or that. And, he certainly wanted to try to make his science understood, but at the same time, he didn't see any reason to try to totally simplify it, because this was, this was something for the Illuminati, right? This is something for people who had the kind of understanding of physics and understanding of mathematics, and understanding of the natural world. That didn't exempt Einstein, by the way, from his own biases. So, for example, he had a very hard time. Laura, I think you probably may know this, but he had a very hard time with quantum mechanics. It's not that he didn't understand it; he just didn't accept that the world was as random as the Heisenberg principle, for example, one of the primary principles in quantum mechanics, maintained. He believed that there was a kind of unified theory of the universe, a unified field theory, and he pursued it for his whole life, even though he didn't come up with the analytical key to it all. So he was often accused, and for those of you who've seen that film of Einstein and Eddington, he was often accused of overthrowing the Newtonian world. And yet he does pay homage to Newton and say, look, these great scientists had a belief that there was some kind of cosmic order. For him, it was Spinozian and, some kind of natural order of things. It wasn't a God that ruled the universe per se. It was a cosmic religion, as he talks about it later on. So, yeah. Anyhow, other thanks. There are other things that you read now in either that first chapter. We want to move on maybe to chapter 4, which is that period of essentially of the Weimar Republic. That period from 1922 to 1932, which is for those of you who love musical theater, and don't we all, cabaret, it was of course one of those great views of Germany, Weimar Germany, from a particular skewed point of view. And I happened to be watching, I highly recommend, on HBO Max, I guess it is. There's a thing called Berlin Symphony, and it's a silent film, except for the musical score, of these random photographs, not random photographs, but filming in the city of Berlin in 1927, a city that, Einstein was part of. And it's an amazing sense of what's going on, because all that ferment that's happening that is captured in this film is very much part of what Einstein is also in the middle of. Yeah. So anybody particularly in chapter 4, he's really interested in promoting the League of Nations. He basically views Wilson through certain blinders, Woodrow Wilson, who promoted the idea of the League of Nations, which was really, by the way, in some ways, an effort to counter Lenin's arguments about revolution and self-determination. And the problem with Wilson was that he was a white supremacist. It's like, so, the League of Nations and the idea of freedom for these countries like Poland didn't include any African nations or Asian nations. So it's like, whereas of course, that's who Lenin was trying to appeal to, is this kind of notion of a world revolution. But Einstein wants to see the League of Nations be something beyond. He wants to see it be supranational instead of a gathering of nationally sovereign countries, and is disappointed when that happens, particularly even though he joins, right, an international committee on intellectual cooperation, which is an offshoot of the League of Nations. Although he tries to say he doesn't want to be seen as a representative of the German people, because he basically says he has no desire to represent people who certainly would not choose me as their representative, which I think speaks to me like Groucho Marx's famous line about, I'd never want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. So, yeah. But I think the threads, again, are this commitment to pacifism, the idea of some kind of international solidarity. Anything else?
Well, also in this group, the French really took it over.
Hmm.
It was held in France. The French bankrolled it. And so I think Germany's resentment after the war, of course, with all the French kind of controlling everything, it had the makings at least of looking like the French were controlling everything, made it very, very difficult for it to succeed from the
Yeah.
get-go.
Yeah, and I think that's why Einstein feels a little embarrassed at times about being in something that may be weighted too heavily to one nation or another. Other points that are raised in this chapter that might have, what did you think of that, his letters to Freud? Unfortunately, I only wish that you would have been able, and you could probably go Google it. You can look at Freud's response to Einstein, which is, very, really interesting. I mean, Freud writes much, much more than Einstein did on this issue about the nature of the psychological obstacles to peace. Einstein, yeah, go ahead, Rosalie.
Yeah, what you were saying, yeah, that really struck a chord. Sid and I were talking about it at length, in terms of his, he wants an explanation. You know what I mean? And he comes up with this theory, and then he's going to the master, to see if his theory is supported or supportable. And when he talks about things like the collective psychosis, and he talks about how, the human nature, under certain circumstances, it's there, it's latent, and then it percolates up given certain social conditions, and then it turns into this collective psychosis, and he has his own theory. And then I found it very, very intriguing. And then when he talks to Freud about it, the Freud's response is such a put down, because he says to him, basically all we need to do is figure out how to change human behavior,
Right.
And Freud says, "Are you kidding?" And he says,
Yeah.
"There's no likelihood." I wrote this down. There's no likelihood of suppressing human aggression. So I think it's on somewhere around page 219 or 220.
Yeah.
Where Freud, responds to that. Yeah, the quote is here in the book.
Yeah.
There is no likelihood of our being able to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. And he goes on to talk about, certain things. The Bolsheviks try and do this one tries to do that, but forget it. So it's just kind of interesting looking at these two giants, both trying to deal with, why this exists. And
So where do you come down on the Freud-Einstein debate? Is as Freud said, is aggression, or as he later said at another point, man will always be wolf to man. Is that aggression so internal, part of the instinct of the the thanatos, the death instinct? I mean, is this so situated in the psyche of our of who we are, that we'll never be able to transcend it? Or like Einstein, do you think that if we can get away from the religion of power, if we can find a way to also minimize testosterone poisoning, if we can find another opportunity to create an environment, I mean, understandably, you're not going to maybe end aggression, but there's ways of minimizing it. So how do you come down on that?
Well, I personally come down more much more in Einstein's corner. And it just reminds me of a number of years ago, my training is as a sociologist. And there was a school of sociology, social biology or biosocial, whatever it was. And
Sociobiology, yeah.
social biology. And for, a number of years there, they were writing all kinds of articles about, forget it. I mean, it's in our genes and, there's no way. And, it's been there since caveman time and, aggression is there. And, the best you can do is try and put some lids on it with laws, but forget it's all human nature. And I remember at the time, I was in a social theory class at the time when this came up, and we were having some very, very robust arguments about that. And I remember being very much against the theory and having the professor who was also, against the theory, presenting such cogent arguments as to why this was a very, very perhaps unenlightened view, and that it wasn't taking a lot of it, and that as sociologists, we shouldn't be looking at the psychology. We should be looking at the social environment and how this forms people. And whether you start with the fact that these instincts are there, and it's the social environment that brings them out or channels them down, whether you start with the opposite point of view, that it's the social environment that creates, if you're in a social environment, kids that live in violent homes, learn violence, societies that perfect violence have kids that learn how to, use weapons when they're very young.
Yeah, one of the foundational documents, books for that was a book by Konrad Lorenz called On Aggression.
Yeah, on aggression, right.
And it sort of picks up one of that thread from Freud, that this is inbred, and it's going to be, it's going to be impossible to purge, to get rid of. Einstein was not that pessimistic,
right,
as Freud, and perhaps maybe more idealistic or optimistic than Freud.
I think he was more scientific, though. I think he was just talking about human learning and and Freud was very, closed-minded, that forget it. This is the way people are, and this is the way it's going to happen. And I think Freud was thinking more scientifically in terms of, Einstein was thinking more scientifically, like how do we deal with this problem? What are the different ways, how do you, that you can channel it, the potential is there. Even if there is violence at the core, there is the potential to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think that's why, Einstein feels committed to the idea that human beings can get beyond war.
Right.
Whereas, the Freudian perspective on it would be that this is going to be part of just who we are as creatures,
right,
of particular, not only habit, but of instincts. Their drives, as Freud called them. He didn't really use the word instinct, but it's a drive. Others on this debate. Lenore.
So I don't know if any of you have heard of Robert Sapolsky. He's at Stanford University, and he has a whole online class about this very topic. And so, because in my education, pitting just like what you were just talking about in terms of is it sociological, is it like, all that. And he just maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, I don't know, a while ago, just put it all together in terms of and he has, I haven't looked at it in a couple, year or so, but lots of documentation and evidence to show we're both right. Freud's right. Einstein, we're both, It's
Yeah.
it's not an either or.
It's not as either or, right? Right.
Exactly. And so, and I, yeah, so I just, and I think that I had a hard time with the first, with chapter 1 and 4 relating to anything speaking to me, because it was just so hopeless that I felt like he was in a maze, and it was like he's gonna find these blockages and couldn't get through, and he'll have to turn the other way. I really didn't realize how determined he was to with an idea that if you looked at the world and the evidence that was going on in the world. So I felt that even the things he said about America and how much he was so positive with America, I don't think he ever traveled, maybe just to Pasadena and to Princeton, I don't know, but there's a lot of parts of the United States in the 1930s that might not have looked as glorious as he was talking about.
Well, I think, he was primarily a visitor in the early 20s to the United States. And you're right, going to California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, which is just an incredible place for anybody who's ever been out there. So you get a very skewed vision of the country from the outside. I think once, he moved here in the 30s and lived here and saw particularly what was going on with Black Americans, he was pretty shocked and very adamant in trying to support something we'll talk about in the last week for civil rights and civil liberties. So he had a kind of rose-colored glasses look at the United States and at Woodrow Wilson early on. I think I want to end up tonight, when we get to chapter 5, something that really speaks probably to all of us as humanists, which is this section on the essay on religion and science. Because what he says, which I think we can talk a little bit more about, is that the ethical behavior, this is in the article on religion and science on 233, the ethical behavior of man is better based on sympathy, education, and social relationships, and requires no support from religion. That should put that on our banner, right? Yeah, he's a humanist. He's definitely a Jewish humanist. There are moments, as we'll see next week in particular, our next session, 2 weeks from tonight, when he feels he needs to emphasize the importance of Zionism, at least as a cultural phenomenon, as part of his Jewish identity and part of the need to contest anti-Semitism and all the threats against Jews, especially in Germany, but not exclusively there. Anything else about Einstein and his belief on religion that you found intriguing?
I'm gonna have to leave.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll see you.
I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm
Yeah.
delivering cookies right now. And
Oh, deliver the cookies.
Fun.
I wish we were close by so we could.
Well, I loved the passage on 228 where he talks about one thing we know, that we're here on earth to help each other. And he says it most eloquently. Just, it was beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that kind of humanism is really evident throughout his whole life. It doesn't necessarily, we all know, you can be this incredible humanistic an ethical spokesperson, and you can still have fundamental flaws. Gandhi was notorious. I mean, he wasn't particularly good towards his wife, and he had his own weirdness in other ways. But he was, for many people in the 20th century, and for Einstein, a really moral force in the world. But it's interesting in that same passage about where ethics come from. He says that he's not really interested in comfort and happiness as something you should be basing ethics on, because if you do that, that's essentially pretty much what would be sufficient only for a herd of cattle, comfort and happiness. Instead, he talks about goodness, beauty, and truth. These are traditional ideals going back to the Greeks. There is, I think he's very much part of that Enlightenment from the 18th century on, people like Kant and others, who the thread is very much of this notion of universal ethics. How do we get to universal ethics? How do we create a world that everyone is valued, no one is diminished, and people are capable of being what later social psychologists would say being self-actualized.
Yeah, Fran, I want to raise a question. It sort of tags on to what you're saying. It comes from page 253, The Road to Peace, letter writing. The first paragraph of it, I have all sorts of notes, and I was hoping to talk about it with the group. Is that okay to spend a couple minutes on that?
Sure, absolutely.
It's really a question I have, but I think it would help to develop the question if I just could read what I'm focused on. In this paragraph, he says at the end, I should hesitate to restate it if it were not constantly in danger of being forgotten, especially in this era of organization and standardization. I believe that the most important mission of the state is to protect the individual and to make it possible for him to develop into a creative personality. I'm raising this related to what you just said about self-actualization. But my question is about what Einstein was reacting to, what was going on for him. This was written in 1931. And he is talking about specifically this era of organization and standardization. I can guess as to what he means, but that is such a pervasive theme about, it connects so strongly to some modern issues as well. And I just would really be curious as to what Einstein was reacting to here. I just would like to hear more about it. And I was wondering what the group thought about that passage. So I'm not sure how clear that was, but he is saying that the focus is really on protecting the actualization of the individual and the creativity of the individual, as opposed to standardization and organization.
How have you seen, Laura, and have others seen Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times?
I have not.
Okay. Chaplin was also, Chaplin met Einstein, by the way, and they spent some time together, and he showed him one of his films. I think it was City Lights they might have seen together. But Modern Times is on one level also a reaction to the idea of standardization, the idea that we are going to be reduced to machines, essentially. And there's a very funny sequence in that Charlie Chaplin film, when you see him working on an assembly line, and all he does is he's turning screws with wrenches, and he does this all day. And as he leaves the line, he continues to, continues to do this, and the soup gets spilled. And I mean, it's a funny criticism of the way that standardization, that kind of mechanization, can be very destructive of human beings. If you see that film, Berlin, 1927 Symphony, it's overwhelming in the way in which these machines are operating in as part of the advanced industrial system. And it's as if they have taken a life of their own. And I think that's what he's reacting to. He's reacting to, mass industrialization. He's reacting to that kind of standardization that often occurs. He, as somebody who has often taken the road less traveled, to say the least, he's very much in favor of being able not to be part of what is, the crowd, so to speak, that vision. So he sees the state as an embodiment of that kind of order and discipline, which is attempting to impose a singularity on people through nationalism, through a variety of things. And in fact, he says earlier in that essay, Laura, the state exists for man, not man for the state. Contrast that with JFK, right? With JFK's, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And Einstein says, no, the state should be our servant. We should not be slaves to the state. And that, that sounds like almost like an anarchist talking. Einstein makes clear he's not an anarchist, but he is concerned about the centralization that he sees developing in a variety of political orientations, whether from the left or from the right. So I think that's one element. What others think about what Laura's raised about this concern?
Well, on a parallel note, it's not the same thing, but a parallel note, a couple of parallel notes, the Bill of Rights, which is supposed to protect the individuals from the government.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically really is supposed to, in my view, protect the minorities from the impositions of majority oppression. Mm-hmm. And the idea that many people have that a democracy means, majority rules, and that's not what our democracy is, a democratic republic, because we have this Bill of Rights and it is the state's obligation to protect the individuals from oppressive majorities. So it's not exactly the same as this kind of route, machinery, but I think it's similar in that it's to protect individuals from oppression by majorities. And I think it's a parallel concept. And another parallel idea is this trend recently, and it's not totally wrong, but in part it's wrong, that we should be teaching kids trades and getting away from liberal arts and all of that kind of thing, is that, and everything should be geared to what their ultimate vocation will be, which is what they do in a way in Europe, is that they evaluate you, or some countries in Europe, in high school at some point, determine what you're going to be and kind of pigeonhole you into a career. And then you go to that school, that kind of an education, whether it's a technician or something more advanced or whatever. And to me, to take us, especially a boy, a 17-year-old boy, and say, this is what you're going to be when the maturation can occur when they're 19 or 20 is, at times backward or off skewed. So I think there's some parallels in that. I don't know if he was thinking any of that, but to me, there are some parallels.
And there is a connection also to that other speech that he gave about militant pacifism, where he basically said the aim of all pacifists must be to convince others of the immorality of war and rid the world of the shameful slavery of military service. So here again, the connection to the idea that those countries that have military conscription make slaves of their citizens by that kind of restraint and that kind of legal system. And I think he understands that that in order to end war, there's going to have to be a much more militant confrontation with the state that will make it clear that war can't continue. More people refuse to military conscription. And that's what some of us believed in during the Vietnam War era, but that's another story. But that gets to some of the things, I think, Laura, that, and there may be others if you still feel that there's something else to be explored in that.
Well, I don't want to bog the conversation down, but if there is interest in the group, I do. When I read it, I was wondering if it was also referring to the standardization of normalcy in Germany at the time. I mean, related to whole, eugenics movement was right preceding this, and this was really leading into some bad stuff about what the normal person was supposed to be like. And that was connected to the US at the time. And I just wonder how much of that affected his thinking. That was intriguing to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, his oldest son grappled with a variety of behavioral difficulties. And and I think obviously Einstein's own history, his own trajectory was often seen as off the scale. I mean, it's
exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting also that in the work on the philosophy of science that Thomas Kuhn did, he talks about the difference between normal science and then what happens when a revolutionary scientific theory comes to dislodge the belief system of normal science. And I think maybe there's less of an understanding of what was this horrific movement developing in the United States and in Germany and in other places around eugenics than about the issue of what constitutes normal science, right? Because Einstein was being hammered by right-wing German scientists, anti-Semitic German scientists, who talked about Jewish physics, believed that this was all poppycock and it was a conspiracy, much like the unfortunate right-wing belief in this country, stoked by evangelical Christians and others about COVID and the vaccine and, you know, and science in general and medical authority in general. So yeah, I mean, I think there's that. I think there's some of that too. Anything else that people wanted to raise tonight? You know, I think our next meeting, which is on October 20th, is probably going to have more that speaks to us, especially because it's more about Einstein's Jewish identity and Zionism. And, you know, I know that there'll be some more people joining us next week who haven't been able to make it either tonight or in these first two sessions. So again, I'd urge you to prepare to look at the chapters 5, 6, and 7. And it's going to have both a chronological connection and a thematic connection to discuss. Other comments or questions?
Well, I'll say something.
Sure.
It's also chapter 5, but I love something really struck me that I hadn't thought about, which he talks about the prestige of government has been lowered by prohibition. And he says, for nothing is more destructive of respect for the government and the law of the land than passing laws which cannot be enforced. And of course, I mean, you know, considering reproductive rights, what's going on today, I thought that was quite brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree. And I just want to say that somehow I got messed up. And I also read chapter 3, which by the way is very good.
I did too, because I was reading, I got mixed up.
I know. I was trying to make sure that we read no more than 3 chapters every 2 weeks, given the fact that, you know, there'd be maybe a total of 60 pages or so of different entries. But it meant also that I was going to jump around a little because I saw some organizing principles that didn't develop in the same ways that the editors of this collection or how they organized it. But yeah, we'll get through most of the stuff anyhow, I think.